Buju, wago shindigu migizi indodem, gazaga squaji mekag, indunjiba. What do Native Americans mean by Landback? The call for Landback is both a practical and philosophical position about restorative justice. So, what it means is this: when there has been an injury, and by the way, this applies to injuries between two individuals. You hurt the feelings of your sibling, your spouse, or your friend, then it's important, if you're interested in keeping the relationship, to look for ways to restore the relationship. So restorative justice is much like, the restoration of a relationship between two people. If someone steals from somebody or someone cheats on their partner, it can be the end of the relationship, but it is possible to save that relationship if there is not just an apology by whoever transgressed, but genuine restorative action. And what the restorative action looks like will vary based upon the needs and agreements of all parties who are affected by whatever happened. This applies to our big collective injustices as well. So, for example, some of the ideas about what restorative justice could look like have included, should there be reparations? So I think there's, for those who actually give this thought and aren't just, dismissive at the face of the idea, we can understand that things like, wealth is kind of self-perpetuating, because people who have money will find ways to take their money, put it into trust funds, pass it on to their children and grandchildren. And so there's a transfer of intergenerational wealth. And that makes wealth kind of self-perpetuating. You're not guaranteed that outcome, but it's much more possible if your parents were wealthy. I think many people can recognize that one of the greatest predictors to if someone is going to college is if their parents went to college. So there are advantages that can get passed forward through generations. But the converse is also true, that poverty is inherently self-perpetuating, and that if someone's family does not have financial resources, and maybe does not have college education, then it is less likely that they themselves will end up with a college education. They will not have financial inheritances or property inheritances, or not at least at the level that many other people might have. And as a result, poverty will self-perpetuate as well. When you look at our historical circumstances, although there are many examples of people who have, done things like come to America in abject poverty and found ways to make it. And of course, it's one of the actually beautiful things about America that that's possible. At the same time, when you look at what does it mean to be black in America, black people in America have actually had a history of slavery longer than they've had a history of freedom. And when you look at the intergenerational, poverty dynamics, vis-a-vis the intergenerational wealth transfer dynamics that have happened for other groups in the population, then you can see what is sometimes referred to as systemic advantage and disadvantage. So one of the restorative justice ideas is reparations, that even though the humans alive today are not the ones who created, for example, the system of slavery, that the systems that were generated have naturally perpetuated poverty, wealth, advantage, and disadvantage. And that's just an example of a type of advantage and disadvantage. There are many others as well. And that there should be some effort to level that out. And that could take many different forms. So one idea is reparations. Another is restorative justice actions. Could be the allocation of funds in scholarship support for people from historically disadvantaged groups. And restorative justice has taken other approaches as well. In the Indigenous space, Landback is one of the frameworks that a lot of Indigenous people have been advocating for as a means to restore justice. Because one of the great injustices that Native people have endured was the taking of their land through force, trickery, and coercion, and that the advantages accrued to not just the United States government, but many of its citizens, created this systemic advantage. For example, when the U.S. government started relocating tribes, out of the Southeast and parts of the Great Lakes to Oklahoma, and then giving away that land for free to white settlers who were able to receive not just free land grants, but the intergenerational transfer of wealth vested in the land and all of the resources obtained from the land. So that would include all of the natural resources, timber, minerals, all kinds of things. And as those families received the benefits of those things, the Indigenous families who were moved off of the land were denied access to the land and its resources. And Landback is an effort to say, hey, this is one of the ways in which Native people were systemically disadvantaged. So to make things right, that we should try to find ways to actually, truly, and physically give land back to Native people. And it's taken many different forms. I'll just share a couple of brief examples that will help illuminate how this can work. So I'm on the governing board for the Minnesota State Historical Society. And in 1862, there was a horrible event in Minnesota, often called the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. It culminated in an action by the Minnesota legislature expelling the Dakota from Minnesota. By the way, that action has never been rescinded, even though there are still Dakota people in Minnesota. There were thousands of Dakota people who were killed. There was a systemic rape of Dakota women held as prisoners at Fort Snelling in Minnesota, and the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. And just a couple of years ago, the Minnesota State Historical Society, which inherited this section of land where this U.S.-Dakota War had first begun, took an action to repatriate a small land parcel to one of the Dakota tribes. And when we did this, it actually involved a multi-agency agreement. So there are statutes that do not allow for the removal of acreage from stewardship of the state of Minnesota. So we had to have a multi-agency agreement to transfer this land to the tribe and transfer other acreage into conservatorship of the state in a totally different part of the state, so that there wouldn't be a, negative draw on the acres stewarded by the state of Minnesota. So there was some complexity to it. But the bottom line is we were able to repatriate this small parcel, and there will be a follow-up parcel that will be repatriated to one of the other Dakota tribes in Minnesota. And I remember when we were on the Zoom call with the tribal chairman, and he said, my dad said that they would never, ever, 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 ever do this. And we just did it. And there were tears in his eyes. And it was a very powerful moment. The Landback effort there is not going to deprive any Minnesota citizen from any access to any additional acreage of state land. It was not about taking anything from white people, but it was about making a symbolic effort to restore some dignity to this really horrible chapter in history. I think it's important to acknowledge that this one symbolic action did not negate all of the other horrible things that happened. Just like, you know, if somebody cheats on their partner, they're not, the transgressor is not just going to say sorry one time and then never talk about it again. They may have to take restorative actions multiple times. And they may have to change behavior and establish new boundaries in their lives. And they may have to reassure their partner, and they might have to do it over and over again. And, you know, so the restoration is not a one and done. It's many different things. So this one little Landback thing that we did with the Dakota communities in Minnesota was just one of what, in my view, should be thousands of restorative actions. And I know it might be kind of unsatisfying for some people to look at this. Look, this stuff happened in the 1800s. I didn't do it. Why do we have to spend our time, energy, or, you know, jiggle around public land parcels in this effort? And the answer is because we don't get to healed and skip all the healing, and we don't get to reconciled and skip all the reconciling. And that in many ways, just like finding happiness is not a state that you arrive at, it's something you practice in your daily life. Finding peace is not something, a destination. It's something you practice in your life, and some days are going to go better than others. It's just like loving your children is not something you arrive at and do one time. You do it over and over again, and there will be bumps in the road. And if we care about our fellow Americans, if we care about historical injustices, then we will keep doing the healing and the loving acts that are required to engineer restorative justice. I've seen many other things happen too at Leech Lake, where I live. There's a huge section of the reservation. 85% of the Leech Lake Reservation is the Chippewa National Forest. And so by congressional action, they took 85% of the reservation and placed it into federal conservatorship, which meant that tribal people living on the reservation had to take allotments in remaining parts of the reservation or move to White Earth if they wanted to have land. And so there were some huge injustices. And of course, the U.S. federal government, the U.S. Forest Service clear cuts federal forest tracts. It's only national parks that are protected. National forests are not. And so the U.S. government has been the sole financial beneficiary of the continued clear cutting of 85% of the Leech Lake Reservation. But last year, the U.S. government agreed to do a Landback action and repatriate a much more significant parcel, an 11,000-acre parcel of the Chippewa National Forest, to tribal conservatorship. And that was another kind of restorative justice action. By the way, that does not stop non-tribal members who have a custom of hunting in the Chippewa National Forest from carrying on with their practices and pastimes. The tribe now stewards the resources for the benefits of all. So again, Landback is not necessarily about taking something away from anybody else. There are many other manifestations for Landback, and I really do believe that it is an emerging effort that has great potential to be a healthy and positive framework for engineering restorative justice. And that is the primary goal and idea about Landback. For those who are like, does that mean they want all the white people to move back to Europe or something like that? I think, first of all, if you just look around, most people would agree that is not going to happen. But I think most Native people are not trying to make that happen. They're interested in reestablishing tribal control over tribal lands, sacred sites, important resources, so there can be food sovereignty, which is tribal control over food supplies and resources in their own lands and reservations where they live. This can apply to lands on reservations and off reservations, and it's kind of a case-by-case exploration. But I think it can really telegraph an effort towards healing, and it can actually have tremendous positive effects on tribal communities and everyone else. After all, when we are involved in helping someone else heal, we are all healed in the effort. When anyone is more fully humanized, we are all more fully humanized. And that's what Landback is all about. Miigwech. Thanks for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer. Let's keep in touch. I'm active on social media, and my website has lots of information on my books, speaking engagements, resources for the Ojibwe language, teachers, and more. Miigwech.